happy you could join us for this New York Times event. As a courtesy to our guests, please silence your cell phones. Most importantly, thank you to all of the Times subscribers who help make these programs possible. Enjoy the event.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gary Segura. I am the Dean of the Luskin School of Public Affairs here at UCLA, and I'm here on behalf of Chancellor Jean Block and Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost Scott Waugh to welcome you to our campus and to this evening's New York Times sponsored event. There are over 11,000 children being held in detention in the United States. By 5-4 votes in the last month, the Supreme Court has instantiated religious-based discrimination, voter purges, racial gerrymandering, anti-abortion subterfuge, and upheld, all by the virtue of a stolen Supreme Court vote. There's international instability. I have trouble remembering that we're cool with North Korea, but Canada is the enemy. And of course, the big three: Twitter, trade war, and treason. So tonight we get to gather to hear some of the finest reporters in the United States talk about some of these issues and some of the coverage that they're affording. I need to point out that tonight's event would not have happened without the support and leadership of Dean Jennifer Mnookin of the UCLA School of Law, who was determined and would not take no for an answer to bring this event here to UCLA. Thank you, Jennifer. The Times is involved in what will come to be, we hope maybe, the historic reawakening of the American newspaper rivalry. The coverage of both the Times and the Washington Post has fundamentally changed journalism in the last 18 to 24 months, seemingly a new breaking story every day. And we know that reporters in the current environment are working, doing their effort in the face of incredible adversity. It would be great to celebrate them, but I want to make sure that tonight's event also holds the New York Times accountable. The New York Times has played a role in our current debate, maybe one that they're not necessarily comfortable with. In April of 2016, one of our guests, Maggie Haberman, said, "Will Trump actually be good for the gays?" Guess what? I don't actually speak for all gays and lesbians, but no. During the campaign, there were efforts to normalize Mr. Trump. There was wildly imbalanced coverage between emails on the one hand and a history of corrupt behavior on the other. Every column written by Maureen Dowd deserves mention. And more recently, the civility debate, the both sides. This is best illustrated in the last 24 hours when Representative Maxine Waters from Southern California called for protest against Trump administration officials. He responded by threatening her physically, and we're all supposed to say, "See, both sides act badly." Trump tweeted today that Representative Waters has very low IQ and is the face of the Democratic Party. Hat tip to my reporter friends, that is not dog whistle, that's flat out racism. So the both sides foolishness, the civility claims, looking at the chance of lock her up and equating them to please leave my restaurant, are actually damaging our civil discourse. So on the one hand, the New York Times is the paper of record, and like all liberals, I subscribe, I promise. I still enjoy reading about the Civil War in the country I was not aware existed until 30 minutes before I picked up the paper. Those sorts of coverage we will never get in another forum. But let's recognize that journalism in the United States has played a role in how we got to where we are. I fear one day I will see a headline that says, Trump declares dictatorship, Schumer and Pelosi intemperate in their response. So, I hope my friends from the Times will forgive me, but it cannot be like a hallelujah. We have to have a mix-it-up discussion. So, with that as an introduction, again, please join me in welcoming our friends from the New York Times to UCLA, the nation's finest public institution of higher education.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that interesting welcome. I'll spare you the same. My name is Jennifer Steinhauer. I'm editor of live journalism for the New York Times. It's truly my pleasure to be with all of you here in Los Angeles for this timely discussion about the midterm elections. I would like to give a special thank you and welcome to the New York Times subscribers, and thank you for your role in making our journalism happen. This evening has been brought to you by the New York Times Subscriber Events Program, which brings our readers behind the stories at the New York Times. Tonight, we are really pleased to bring to you some of the key members of our political reporting team. Adam Nagourney, our Los Angeles bureau chief, who's covered nearly every presidential campaign since 1988. White House reporter extraordinaire Maggie Haberman, aka the Trump Whisperer, who was part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize for coverage of Donald Trump's advisors and their connections to Russia. Nate Cohn is a domestic correspondent for The Upshot, specializing in polling and demographics, the man behind the forecast needle seen around the world. Here to lead this discussion is a man who knows all these topics well. He's one of the Times' chief political writers who helped lead coverage of Donald Trump's presidential campaign in 2016. Please join me in welcoming my very esteemed colleagues, Alex Burns, Adam Nagourney, Maggie Haberman, and Nate Cohn.
Thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate your making the time to join us this evening. Thank you for the measured introduction. I wish the dean had mentioned any of those things when we were hanging out in the green room before.
There was plenty of opportunity.
But why bring it up to my face?
No, it's much better to do it.
But we can talk about all of that. We're very, very happy to be challenged by anybody about any subject, as long as it's actually relevant to our areas of expertise. So we're just going to jump right in. We sort of thought we would be talking more about the California primaries than the other primaries that have unfolded, but we have some sort of shocking news tonight in New York that Joe Crowley, the fourth-ranking Democrat in the House of Representatives, was defeated in a primary. This is a guy who is seen as maybe the next Speaker of the House if Nancy Pelosi stepped down, and I'm wondering if I could just ask Adam to start by kind of reacting to that as a guy who knows sort of the dynamics of New York politics and California politics and the Congress as well. That what do you take away from that as a lesson about the Democratic Party right now?
It seems to me that if I was a moderate Democrat facing a primary, I'd be really scared. I mean, obviously the left is really, really, really energized in elections. We've seen elements of it this week, but that was a really stark example of it. He won by a lot. He lost by a lot. Crowley, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think anyone wrote about this or saw this coming, right? I mean, it's a real shock, including him. So I think
we expected it would be closer than the normal sort of New York Democratic congressional primary, right? But Nate, we didn't see that this was likely to happen, right?
Not to my knowledge. One thing that I think will be really fun to look at afterwards is what the Latino turnout looked like. This is a plurality Latino district that was drawn to elect Latino candidates but has a white representative. In recent elections, like in the mayoral general election last year, white voters represented a plurality of the electorate. But in the presidential electorate, Hispanics outnumbered white voters by a large amount. I think it'll be interesting to see whether there was a big increase in Latino participation, whether that was a factor.
I think there's one factor too, which is that it was a woman, and I don't think that that can be overlooked. I think that the amount of authentic, organic female energy on the Democratic side is huge, and I think this was an example of it.
In the green room, we were talking about what this might mean for, I don't mean to put you on the spot, Andrew Cuomo. I mean, after this, how can we put you on the spot now, right? This is easy.
Sure, go for it. I mean, Cuomo and
he's
Adam,
the governor of New York.
He's the governor of New York, and Adam knows him very well and did a fantastic New York Times Magazine piece on him a long time ago on a race that he pulled out of. But, you know, to that end, Cuomo, as you know, has always been a bit of a skittish politician, and so he was already anxious about this primary race before there were all of these signs. You have Cynthia Nixon has actually run a really good race. She also goes into it with high name ID. She goes into it with a clear message. She showed out of the gate she was not afraid of taking him on. I don't know whether that will translate into her besting him or even coming close, but it has the Cuomo folks, I think, pretty anxious.
So let's talk more about what we've seen in primary season so far, right? That, you know, you can't always roll over the lessons that you see in the primaries to the general election, but, you know, we're most of the way through primary season now, especially, you know, as of now on East Coast time with New York and a couple other states wrapping up. So, you know, what do you take out of what we've seen so far? What is the biggest thing, and I'll start with Nate and work back this way this time. What is the biggest thing that you take away from the actual votes that we've seen cast so far?
The first thing that comes to mind is something that you just wrote about, which is that Democratic turnout is way, way up. And that's true here in California, where, you know, I think that the turnout is now almost at 7 million. And for comparison, in the 2014 general election, the turnout was 7.2 million. So the primary turnout is almost matching the 2014 general election, and we know that general election turnout always swamps primary turnout. So that gives you a hint of what kind of turnout we might see in the general election. That's a pattern that we've had all year. And that obviously has important implications for the Democrats' chance of taking over, not insofar as I would say, like, if the turnout's high, then the Democrats win, or something as simple as that. But, you know, the Democrats have struggled in recent midterm elections because of low turnout, particularly among young and non-white voters. And so, you know, I think that seeing this increase in participation now at least reduces one of the reasons why you could have been skeptical about their chances later.
Well, that's presumably part of what we're seeing in New York tonight, right? Because Joe Crowley, you were mentioning just off stage, is not the only incumbent Democrat who's in a real dogfight with a much younger challenger.
Yeah, Yvette Clarke in the 9th district, which is, it's a majority black district, but with some of the most like iconically white liberal parts of Brooklyn attached to it, like Park Slope, is a lot. When we were just off stage, it's a 1-point race with like 85% of the vote in. And so it also tells you a little bit about what kind of Democrats are voting too. These are engaged activists who are paying attention to the candidates. And, you know, I think that it's another interesting sign for Cuomo, because, like, you know, if you look back to the Clinton race, you know, her trump card was support among non-white voters. So here are two majority non-white districts where liberal lefty candidates are doing pretty well. I think that's interesting.
I do think in the case of Crowley in particular, he hadn't had a real race in forever. And so I do think that's important to bear in mind, just in terms of the gap. I mean, I think he probably would have lost anyway. It is a reminder, though, that the New York political establishment is actually so old and so entrenched and so creaky that I do think it is showing, and what we've been seeing in all of these primaries is there's a huge amount of Democratic turnout, but I do wonder if New York actually shows something specific to New York, or how much can be extrapolated out to.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because, you know, in California over the last few years, there's also been a couple incumbents defeated in, not in primaries, but in general, Democrat versus Democrat general elections, right? You do have this kind of generational turnover of a kind in the statewide offices, not really driven by primaries, but just term limits more than anything else.
And age, right?
And
yeah,
age,
some of these
right.
guys are getting really old.
So what does that, I mean, what do you take from that here and there, and what does that tell you about just this sort of moment in Democratic politics?
I mean, California in particular, clearly we're having a generational change here. Jerry Brown is stepping down because of term limits. I think he probably would have run again were it not. I mean, Dianne Feinstein almost didn't run because she's so old. So we're just seeing, I mean, I'm saying that's what she should, but so we're just seeing this kind of new wave of people coming in. I think we're seeing it in New York too. The other thing we're just seeing, the other thing that's really hit me about this race in particular is that I've covered a bunch of midterms over the years. I know you have too. And there's always like this argument whether it's going to be a local race or a nationalized race. Except maybe since 2010, the Tea Party, I can't remember a race being so clearly nationalized. This is a race about national issues. It's not about what your congressperson can do to deliver deliver pork or anything like that. This is about Donald Trump. This is about Trump care, and we'll see later whether it's about taxes. As well.
Well, and that's really true on the Republican side too, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
The Grimm race in New York would be the other counterpoint to that, right? I mean, on Staten Island, there was a primary challenger who was not endorsed by Trump, who was seen as a more authentic version of Trump, and lost by a lot. So, to your point, I mean, everything becomes about Trump, right? It's on the left and on the right. On the right, it's more galvanized as Trump's party than I think some people in certain races had expected it would be.
So that, to me, makes me think that the government next time is going to be even more, politics is going to become even more polarized.
Yes.
I mean, the result of the Crowley race, the
Yes.
result is people are going to move more and more to their corners.
Well, I mean, that's what we saw happen on the Republican side after Eric Cantor lost, right? Joe Crowley is now the second future Speaker of the House to lose a primary election that he expected to win easily. And in some ways, that was scary for the Republican Party because it was hugely destabilizing of the culture on the Hill. And we'll see if that happens on the Democratic side. It also reflected this authentic outpouring of energy on the right that led them to take the Senate later that year and then the White House 2 years after that. Nate, is there anything that stands out to you on the Republican side of the primaries so far?
Not as much. I mean, and that's just in part because most of the competitive races have been on the Democratic side, with most of the races that we're following being vulnerable Republicans who seem like they could lose to Democrats. So, not to be boring, but I haven't read too much out of the Republican side. I mean, certainly Grimm tonight is a big data point on, whether on the role that Trump can play in the election on the Republican side of the ticket.
Is the Grimm thing sullied by the fact that he is a convicted felon, right? So I'm just wondering.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's
I'm not being sarcastic.
That was
the
not
poll
as
trend is
damaging as you
interesting,
thought it
though.
would be.
Yeah,
It really
yeah,
wasn't.
yeah.
I mean,
The poll trend is interesting to me, though. I mean, if 3 weeks ago, before Trump endorsed
Right.
Donovan, Grimm led in a Siena poll by 10.
Right.
Last week, there was a Remington research poll that now had Grimm up 10. I don't know if you looked on Twitter today, but there were all sorts of reporters at the polls in Staten Island talking to people who were basically telling, the various reporters there, like, well, I liked Grimm, but then Trump said to vote for Donovan, so I decided to vote for Donovan. And now he wins by 30. So I think that I don't want to read too much into 3 data points, but I think the mechanism here is potentially straightforward. Oxen's razor to me is Trump told them to do something, they did it.
Which is interesting, though, because that's not it didn't quite work out that way for him last year,
It
right?
did not.
Yeah.
But maybe Trump said, don't be Alabama again. So maybe they're learning the lesson.
So Maggie,
It is New York also.
if you would, talk about how Trump sees these primaries, what the experience of, it seemed like he sort of touched the hot stove a couple times last year and got burned and sort of stepped back from it for a while, but now he keeps on getting into these primaries. So what's the dynamic behind that?
So he's actually been doing more of what his advisors actually want him to do, with some exceptions. When it came to the Sanford race in South Carolina, he tweeted and nobody knew that he was going to do that. His political team was completely surprised. So you have the usual stew of his, sort of personal grievances, areas where people have been able to direct him, such as the Staten Island race. I think that, left to his own devices, he would have gone with someone like Grimm. But he does personally like Dan Donovan. Rudy Giuliani, his lawyer, had urged him to endorse Dan Donovan. In general, the president is, according to everyone I've spoken to, less alarmed by the prospect of what losing the House could mean for him, because the general accepted logic in his White House is that would be very bad for him, for a whole host of reasons.
How do you figure?
Just a couple things could happen. But impeachment, grinding the gears to a halt of government. But he really likes this idea of divided government. I mean, he, as you know, constantly needs to be fighting and constantly needs a foil. And so he seems to be more focused on that idea than on the sort of danger Will Robinson prospect.
So is it that he doesn't believe he will lose the House, or doesn't sort of fully conceptualize the implications of that?
I mean, it's not that I don't think he's capable of understanding them.
No,
Clear.
sure.
Yeah, I just think he's refusing to allow that it's going to happen. I think he refuses, as you and I have seen many times over the course of the campaign in 2016, if he just decides he's going to put blinders on, he does. But I think he genuinely has convinced himself it will not happen. I mean, we wrote about a dinner that he had with his legislative affairs director and a bunch of other people, and they kept saying to him very starkly, like, we are going to lose the House based on the way this is going, and he just kept saying that's not going to happen. And I think that's still where he is. And I think he feels like, and if it does happen, that's not the biggest deal in the world, which seems like a very sunny view for somebody given this tax set.
It's like thinking about death, though, right?
Well,
if you just focus on that, then
right.
you can't really
There's
do
been a lot.
anything else.
There's been a lot made lately of the fact that he is a bit fatalistic, and he is from a pretty grim view of it. But there is a degree where he's just sort of like, I can't control that. And as you know, he doesn't really have long strategic goals. He thinks in very tiny increments of time, and he just looks at what's in front of him.
Adam, do you think he made a difference in California, where there was this real chance that you'd have a Democrat versus Democrat general election for governor, then Trump backed one of the Republican candidates and he made it through? Do you think that was important?
Absolutely. I think that literally you could see in the polling, the second that he backed Cox, Republicans went behind him. That made it. And when he first did it, like, I was like, I have to admit, I was like, huh? Because like Cox didn't even vote for him, right? He voted for whoever the Libertarian was, right? But then, I realized the whole idea is that he wanted to have a Republican versus Democrat at the top of the ticket to help get turnout. I'm sure Kevin McCarthy, I'm not sure that I don't think he thought this up himself. To get turnout, I'm not putting down the president, to get turnout up for these congressional races. But it was instant. It was really instant. And then the only question is whether Antonio Villaraigosa, who used to be the mayor here, would be able to pull together whatever base he had here to make it to second, and he did. He lost by a lot.
And do you think that ends up as a good bet for Republicans to have Cox at the top of the ticket?
I think, listen, they don't have a lot of cards to play. So they have that card to play. It's better that than not. They have the gas tax. Are you aware of this? There's a repeal of the gas tax that's now been put on the ballot, I think today or yesterday. That should probably bring some Republicans out. So, it's not, it's like chicken soup, right? It doesn't hurt. It definitely helps. The alternative, there's no reason, there's no reason for Republicans to turn out at all without a Republican on the ballot. There's no Republican candidate for Senate.
Right.
So yes, the bottom line is Trump. I think Trump really helped Cox. I think we've seen it again, right? Trump has a base of voters. We can argue about how many they are, right? I think it's not a huge number of people, but we can argue about that. And they clearly are responding at this point to whatever he wants. And it's more an issue on the Republicans, I think, and I defer to you guys, who are out there now, it's more of an issue on the Republican side than in the general election, because we're talking about 35% of the electorate, if that.
That is really passionately connected to him.
Yeah, I'm not even sure it's that much, right?
No, I don't think it's that much.
Yeah, I'm being generous, but that doesn't win you an election.
Nate, how many people feel that passionate connection to the president?
The passion is a fun qualifier, though. Passion's a fun qualifier, though. I think that in the polls that sort of ask, like, do you have a very favorable impression, or do you very strongly approve of Trump's performance? That number's like in the low 20s usually. And there's a big chunk of Republicans who somewhat approve of him. And that number doesn't seem to erode ever, which is why people assume it's a stable group of 35, which might be true. Maybe there are people who, they say they somewhat approve of him for reasons related to his character or his conduct, but actually really strongly support him on the issues or could never imagine voting for a Democrat if that were the alternative. But I think that the passionate number is it's a smaller group. But that may not be like the analytically relevant group, the group that always sticks with him no matter what.
Explain what you mean by that.
Like, there could be some people that just love Trump and they have their MAGA hats on, right? And then there's another group of people who they don't wear the hat, but they're still showing up for him at every point where it's mattered for him. And that second group.
When you say analytically relevant, that's the group you're talking about?
I think that the group that matters, if you're thinking about the midterm election, is this 35% sort of group, not the 25%. If he was in a lot of trouble, like if we were talking about impeachment again, or not again, if we were talking about impeachment or a primary again, to formulate it the way I intended to, then that 25% would be the one we cared about more, I think. But I don't think we're at that point.
But you're saying he could deliver this 35%? Either to himself or to candidates?
I don't think that's a very impressive thing to do for what it's worth.
No, I know, I don't either.
Yeah, but I think he has 35% of the vote that even at his worst moments, has basically supported him. And I wouldn't say that that's unconditional support or something, but at any moment where it's mattered, he's had it.
It's pretty close to unconditional. What was his line? I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and they wouldn't leave me? I mean,
Yeah, then somewhere between 25 and 35 on the shooting.
I mean,
we haven't tested that. We haven't tested it yet.
It seems like one of the big questions there, though, right, is that in a presidential race where you have a very polarizing figure on the other side of the ballot, somebody who the conservative base has hated for 30 years, that's a turnout driver as well in a way that Republicans don't necessarily have in the midterms, right? So one of the things that I feel like people get wrong about midterm elections is there are three choices, right? You could vote for Republican, vote for Democrat, you could stay home. So Maggie, I wonder how focused the White House is on this idea of making sure that people who support the president show up for other Republicans who may not actually share anything in particular with them.
They're quite concerned about it. And realistically, look, they have a problem because there are a limited number of states that you can send Trump to where he is just a pure net positive, right? I mean, basically, there are a bunch of states where if he goes personally, and I'm just speaking about his travel because that's the best way to galvanize his folks, or one of the best ways. There's 6 states that have Senate contests. They're basically red states where he can go and he can really do no harm. There are really not down ballot races where there's cross currents, where he sort of stirs up trouble inadvertently, or by going off script when he's there, as we got to see again last night, or vertently in South Carolina. But they're very worried about it. There is yes, he's got this 35% to Nate's point, but there's really a limit to what he can do to get the I could just stay home people out, with the exception of, and I think you did this accidentally, but talking about impeachment, which is something that they are fine talking about right now because they have decided that this is something, now I'm not saying this is true, but this is how they view it, is they can gin up their base, which frankly has been the Trump tactic all along, which is, the defend me tactic. And it's not novel in politics, but he tends to leave a pretty big imprint when he does this, and they think that that's a decent weapon in their arsenal. I don't know if it will be, but that's what they think.
Do you see impeachment catching on as an issue on the Democratic side?
Yeah, especially after what happened tonight, right? Yeah, I do. But this whole debate that's going on, I mean, I'll probably get some dissent in this room. I do think that it does not help the Democratic Party win back the House to make this race about impeachment. I'm not saying what's right or wrong or whether you should be impeached. I'm just saying tactically.
Nancy Pelosi would agree with you.
That was like one tenth of the room. I'm not saying that. I just think it's, Nancy Pelosi thinks that too. I just think that's like, it just doesn't help. But it's going to come up, and you'll see it in more races, and you'll see. I saw the California Democratic Chairman Eric Bauman, I think, the other day said that he was. Did anyone see this? Said he was open to impeachment as well. He tends to be more restrained on that kind of stuff.
Right.
Jerry Brown is not, in case you were wondering.
There's one factor, by the way, that the White House, that I should have mentioned before, and you just reminded me of it, that they do talk about, and they don't really know how this will cut. And the big X factor is, what does Robert Mueller, the special counsel, do, right? And so there is still this outstanding question of, I think that the chances of the president agreeing to sit for an interview are less than 0, and I think that will be made official in the next week or so. Giuliani has offered conflicting statements, but he seemed to indicate July 4th was their deadline for when they were going to give an answer on this. They know they can't drag this on forever. They have stalled as long as they can. What they're hoping to do is delay Mueller from issuing a report before the election. And if he does do it before the election, they're just planning on muddying it up as much as possible. That's a big question mark. I don't know how, if you accept their belief or what they claim, which is that Mueller will stick to federal, to DOJ guidelines and not indict a sitting president, that's already off the table, then you are left with a potentially very scathing report to Congress. And I don't know what that looks like.
Are they anticipating a very scathing report?
Yeah.
Because, well, no, it's
one word answer. No, it's
fewer than 140 characters.
That's
No, because it's interesting on the Mueller dynamic, right?
280.
280 now.
on the Mueller dynamic, it's this anvil hanging over the White House, right? But he's also this kind of useful shield for Democrats right now, right? That, I mean, the most popular answer on impeachment is not yes or no, it's let the investigation run its course, right? So what how do you answer that question once the investigation has run its course?
Right. It's a great point.
Well, I mean, I'm assuming, and I'll defer to you, I'm assuming that report is not going to just be rhetoric. It'll be very, very fact and evidence based. So there'll be a lot of stuff to sort of talk about.
Right.
Yeah. And they also expect that, let's say they weren't anticipating a damning report, they expect that even something that is just mildly problematic is going to be amplified very loudly by Democrats, and I think that's a reasonable guess. So, I mean, whatever is actually in there is unlikely to be whatever the message is, unless it's really bad, in which case you will hear it sort of all the time. But if it's the, obstruction light version, it will still be said very, very loudly.
It's a legal term.
It's a legal term, obstruction light, L-I-T-E.
Nate, do we have a sense of how much the Mueller probe sort of is a thing that your casual voters are aware of?
I think there are a really surprising number of voters who don't have an opinion on the Mueller probe and don't know who Robert Mueller is and don't have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of him. It's really a surprising number. I mean, if you're in my social milieu, like, people are asking about Robert Mueller all the time and foaming at the mouth about every latest
Have you all
development.
heard of Robert Mueller?
Yeah, I mean, conduct a poll here in Santa Monica and see what the number is. But there are you can still find even today polls where 20% of voters don't say they have an opinion of Robert Mueller, and polls overrepresent people who care about politics. That's why they're taking the polls. So the true number is even lower than that, or higher than that, since I was referring to the proportion that don't have an opinion or knowledge of him. And I agree that the post-Mueller period is going to be really delicate for the Democrats because, although 35% is not a very impressive share of the electorate to hold, the Democratic coalition, or if you prefer, the opposition to the president, does not translate very well on the House or Senate map this year. I mean, they're lucky to have 6 states that they can send the president to, in my view, at 35%. And there are 25 congressional districts that were carried by Hillary Clinton, and there are 23 districts of the Democrats that need to take the House, and you're not going to go 25 for 25. So you got to win place the president won. It's going to be a tough spot.
So talk about that Democratic coalition, that this is sort of a work in progress, but it's one of the things that we're sort of seeing gel in the primary season and in the off-year elections last year. What does the Democratic coalition or the anti-Trump coalition, what is that?
I mean, so far it looks like the Clinton coalition, but like on steroids, and that it's the same group of voters, relative to each other. The enthusiasm with respect to each other is the same. So for instance, black turnout declined between 2012 and 2016. So black voters were like a relatively large share of the Obama coalition with respect to the Clinton coalition. Black voters are still a relatively low share with respect to the other elements of the Democratic coalition of whatever this resistance or opposition to the president is. And just as Clinton made her largest gains among well-educated white voters, the turnout surge among well-educated white voters is huge. I mean, just to take California, in California's 49th district, which is the district that was represented by Darrell Issa, it runs from basically the north side of La Jolla up to Laguna Beach. The turnout there in the primary was up, or is up, and the vote that may be still coming in there in San Diego at least, in San Diego County rather. The turnout was up 12% for a primary over 2014. And that's been a pattern in special elections so far. It's a pattern in the polls, and I think it's going to show up. There's no way it's not going to show up in November. It's just a question of how much it shows up in November.
So let's talk more about those California races that I feel like, and tell me if you disagree. There's sort of 2 schools of thought on California. One is that you've got 7 Clinton districts in the state. It's a state that hates the president, and so Democrats ought to be able to go 7 for 7 in those seats, right? And there's another school of thought that says, well, wait a second, Mimi Walters is not a pushover, right? Jeff Denham has had tough races before. That before you start counting those 7 in the Democratic column, like slow down and sort of look at these candidates sort of person by person. Which side of the spectrum are you closer to?
I'm closer to that. I don't think they're going to win. I don't think Democrats are going to win 7. I think that's a lot to ask. But I think they could probably win. I won't say which ones, but I think they could probably win 3 or 4, given how unpopular Trump is, how energized the Democratic base is. Issues like, I think, we'll see, the tax code, which really hurts California. Issues like the environment. There's just a lot of stuff that really, really, I think is going to galvanize Democrats and depress Republicans. But the idea that the Democrats are going to be able to come in here and sweep all 7 seats, or maybe even get 8, one of the outliers, I think that's not likely. I mean, that's a long shot. But there's a reason. These are very competitive races, and they should be able to pick up a lot.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that I would be really surprised that the Democrats won 7 races. And one thing that's interesting to me is that Democrats have had a really great recruitment cycle, but they have not had a good recruitment cycle in California. And I don't just mean the mess in the top 2 primaries. I think that, I could be wrong, but I don't think that any of the Democrats who won the nomination in those 7 Clinton districts are previous holders of elected office.
That's right, yeah.
You know, there are a lot of individual candidates who have like real weaknesses. You know, T.J. Cox in California's 21st was running in the 10th district earlier this year, and he got blown out in the primary. I mean, by 25 or 30 points. I don't remember what the final number is, but I think that David Vallejo got 63% of the vote in a district that Clinton won by 16. I mean, it's very difficult to lose the general election when you have 63% in the top 2 primary. It basically never happens. And by basically never happens, I mean it hasn't happened. I'm just hedging that it could happen in the future. And you know, you were talking about the taxes.
Right.
You know, that you would think that'd be a real vulnerability for Mimi Watts, Walters. But you know, the Democrats nominated a candidate in Katie Porter who supports single payer, and you know is not the candidate. I'm not saying you can't win if you support single payer, but you're not going to take advantage of raising taxes.
Right.
You know, if that's your platform, and so the candidates still really matter, I think, and that's played out in the special elections. And I think that the Democrats didn't get a good crop in California.
So if I could have designed this like a game show, then 2 times there, Nate would have said a word that made like bells go off and confetti come down. And that was top 2. I'm dying to get into it with Adam about the top 2 system.
Okay.
Can we say now, we've had a couple cycles of this, can we say now whether it is a success or a failure at achieving its stated goals?
Well, the stated goals was to get the Democratic Party to spend $3 or $6 million it otherwise wouldn't have spent and panic the place completely. But then got all us reporters out here to California in this great state. I guess it has succeeded. But I don't think. Listen, I mean, has it succeeded in changing the sort of nature of the races? I don't think so. Has it helped voters? We came really close to having a situation where voters in districts that voted for Clinton, Democrats, could have faced 2 cookie-cutter Republicans in the fall. And I think it was just for a bunch of money spent by the Democrats and serendipity that it didn't happen. So my sort of argument would be that this system does not appear to be working very well.
Does it have redeeming qualities?
Got us out here. I mean, it's one of those things where I live here anyway, but it's one of those things where got them here, got Jonathan Martin here. You know, it's one of those things where I think that it looks really good when you're discussing it in a political science class at UCLA or USC, right? Sorry, well, you asked for it. But I think that when you get the reality of it, it's always different. It's one of those things when you sit around and you drink white wine and talk about like how politics is too partisan and top 2 will solve it. And I just think the reality is it doesn't. This is a partisan country. The government, certainly Congress, is a Republican-Democratic system, and I don't think this helps. I don't think it produced better candidates. I think it produced panic, and I have not seen evidence yet that it is an improvement. That's just my opinion.
So I mean, I guess the counter argument that I would have hypothetically made would be that you also have states. I live in New York City, right? I'm not registered with a political party. Everything is decided in the Democratic primary, right? So would voters be better off, I guess, in aggregate, with all of these sort of Los Angeles-based, San Francisco-based districts, where you end up with a low turnout primary, offering up a general election with a choice between a Democrat who will certainly win and a Republican who is not even really a choice?
In other words, you have more of a choice in a primary. Yeah, but
some people would argue,
but some people would argue that the downside is the risk is too high, and then it's a partisan country, right? And you ended up with a situation where, I mean, in the governor's race, you have 2 pretty extreme people, right? Some way to the left, way to the right, and the rest of them are pretty, I take what you say, but there's still fairly generic differences between Republicans and Democrats in all these congressional races. So it ended up not having that much of a difference in the end.
No, it is sort of revealing that there are a couple of those primaries where I think on paper you might have thought that a Democrat, if you're a Democrat running for Congress in Orange County and there's 6 other Democrats running, maybe there's a path to sort of run it closer to the middle, right? And really none of them tried it.
None of them tried it. So that was the stated goal of it, was to get candidates to become more moderate. I don't see any evidence of that happening. I don't see a lot of that evidence happening in California.
So speaking of moderating, Maggie, if the Republicans do get waxed in November, is the president capable of course correcting? No, really, but
I know.
there's this history of the day after the midterm election, the like humiliated White House chief of staff goes out and says, yeah, we got completely destroyed.
Yeah, we will never see that. But will you see some sort of version of them publicly insisting this is all fine and will be great, and then making tweaks to their program? Possibly. I'm loath to predict what he will do in that situation and what they will do. I mean, a couple things. What his aides will want to do is probably different than what he wants to do, just if history is a guide. What he will do is very difficult to predict because he will never have been in this kind of a situation. But what we do know is that he will never acknowledge a loss. So he will have to paint this as some kind of victory, which is part of why I think that he is suggesting to people that he's just fine with a divided government. And some of it is pre-spinning it. I think that you will see some level of course correction. I just don't think he's capable of fully doing it, and I think that everything that he's done over the course of a year and a half has just been all about retreating into his base. And so I can't see him modulating or modifying, and I think that he will assume that just everything will just grind to a stop. Because if Democrats,
He will assume that, or we should assume that?
I think that we should, and I think he actually is assuming that, and I think therefore everything with him is the calculus of how he will not have to take responsibility for these things, and therefore it's that person's fault. So in his mind, I believe what you will see is him thinking that a Democratic House, and if they impeach him, that's a different issue. If the Republicans still hold the Senate, then I think that he just thinks it becomes a political document. But at the end of the day, if there's something that he can claim it's not his fault, I think that he will feel like that's okay, and he will just continue to say what he's saying and do what he's doing. The question becomes how many hearings with subpoenas, become problematic for this White House, and how they grapple with that. I don't know the answer to that.
Before we get to the subpoenas.
Sorry.
So what is that? So who takes the blame then?
In that case, I suspect that he will end up blaming congressional leaders who he will say talked him into backing candidates who were a bad idea, just as we saw with Luther Strange, for instance, right? In that Senate contest, he went with who Mitch McConnell wanted him to go in the primary. Roy Moore ended up as the nominee. Then Trump did this sort of strange backing into an endorsement and refusing to condemn Roy Moore's predatory behavior with young women, and by young women I mean children. And so I think you will see him slough it off primarily to his party. The one thing that Republicans who are either pollsters or strategists who are working with some of the outside groups say to me over and over again is that while Trump is doing marginally better, and I'm interested in what you see in this, but while Trump is doing marginally better in polls, the Republicans are continuing to really struggle. And him sort of looking like he's standing apart from a do-nothing Congress has benefited him. So I suspect you will see more of that. And you will see, he'll blame this staff member and that staff member. God only knows what White House staff members will still be there by the time we get to the midterms. But I suspect you will see a pretty huge house cleaning if a lot are still left.
I believe Maggie just teed
I just vaulted to you.
Yeah, well, I think that one, your instinct seems totally sound to me that like the absence of a real legislative agenda has been great for Trump and probably for the Republicans more generally, especially since they got their victory in
right. They're running
tax
things,
bill.
and they got the tax bill, but they're in charge, and
Yeah.
they're still claiming they're not.
Yeah.
It's not their fault.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good thing they have set up in that respect. And the second thing, which I think it like follows from that and sort of addresses the question of what Trump will do, is that it actually doesn't address the question of what he'll do, but I think it affects the way it might play out. And it's something that surprised me when I first learned it, but I think upon reflection it makes some sense, and that's that the president's approval rating usually goes up after they lose a midterm election. And that, if you, and I don't want to be too complicated, but like if you just look at all the things that potentially affect a president's approval rating, and you see what causes to change, like losing a midterm election is a good event for you. And that's like counterintuitive, I think, but I think it is also related I think it follows from the same sort of principle that would lead the president's approval rating to go up now that the Republicans aren't doing anything, which is that the country tends to instinctively push back against the party that's in power, and it has a tendency to push back against change, and gridlock creates that naturally. And that, I think, it's a pretty good place for an incumbent president to be heading into re-election. Leaving all this impeachment stuff aside, of course, and all the very unusual things that could play out.
The only caveat that I would put on that, and I mean that's where my head is, but the only caveat that I would put on all of that is that he has had this ability over the last 3 years, basically, right, the campaign and then the presidency, to tell people that this table here is a sofa. And it has been, no matter how many times you would say this is actually a table, there would be a percentage of people who are just not going to believe it because he's saying that. And I think that where you saw the spell break on that with him was the border separations, because there was finally an issue where he could not tell people it was just their lying eyes. And once that has started to erode, I don't know if that becomes harder for him to then keep pushing blame on other people, say after a midterm loss. I don't know if his ability to wave that wand is diminished, especially given that the media, to its great credit, has not moved off of this issue in the border separations and is still very focused on it.
Well, this reminds me of Maggie and I covered the Trump campaign together. The theory of the case for a lot of his opponents, right, in that primary was, you got to just beat him somewhere,
Yes.
right, and start showing people that he's not invincible
Yes.
and he doesn't win all the time, and
Right.
Make that guy go out there and explain losing New Hampshire by 10 points
Right.
to Marco Rubio or whatever. Never really happened.
No.
So the theory, we've never really seen a great test of that theory.
No, we haven't. And what we also haven't, what we haven't really seen is, I mean, part of the problem with that theory, A, it hasn't been tested, but B, I mean, the one thing that I think becomes more complicated for people who are hoping for a reprisal of that effort is one of the big mistakes that people who blame the media only for what happened in 2016 is that they miss the fact that it wasn't just that Trump was famous. It wasn't just that Trump was, a rich guy, which is obviously a subject of debate on its own, but it's that he has been part of the cultural fabric in one way or another for 30 years. And you and I had the same experience of going to Iowa and talking to voters, and they would talk to us about The Apprentice, and they would describe it as if he was making, well, he would make these decisions, and he's a leader, and he's a businessman, and he built this huge business. And the line between news and entertainment for a lot of viewers is not what we know it to be. And so people had formed opinions of whether he was a winner already. And I'm not even sure how much, he lost the Iowa caucuses. And we all thought that was going to be the beginning of, sort of the cracks, right? But that's not what happened. And yes, he came back and won New Hampshire by over 10 points after that. But I think even if it had been a lesser win, or even if he had lost another one, I think he was so defined for voters that they believed he would eventually get there, basically.
No, and I want to come back to the media and Trump just before we go to the audience questions, where I feel like we will probably revisit that subject again. But it seems to me that sort of the phenomenon that we encountered with The Apprentice, right? That if you're going to tell the story of how Trump sort of worked the media to rise to the presidency, you have to start that timeline a long time ago, right? And you have to not just look at news, because once you start looking for him in popular culture, he's everywhere.
Literally everywhere, yeah.
Nate, I want to put you on the spot a little bit and talk about polling. You sort of alluded at a couple points to just asterisks that you'd put on the kind of public numbers that we're seeing about Mueller, or about that you have to be aware that the people who respond are by definition more engaged. Like, how do you process midterm polling? How is it different from presidential election polling, and what is the value of just that generic ballot that we see week to week?
Those are all really good questions. Midterm polling is supposed to be easier in some respects because it deals with a more reliable group of voters. More reliable voters are easier to contact. You can pick them off the voter file and be like, I'm going to talk to the people who vote in primaries and general elections, and you think you have your group. I think it might be a little bit more difficult this year, given that we're seeing pretty substantial changes in the turnout patterns that we've seen compared to 2014 or 2010. I think we saw that maybe in the Virginia gubernatorial race, where the polls underestimated the Democrats by a lot, which obviously is a reversal of what we saw in 2016. And there's no reason to assume that the polling errors that happened in the past will move forward. Pollsters could adjust for what happened in Virginia, just as they've made adjustments to account for what happened in 2016. But midterm turnouts are going to be very difficult to predict. One thing that I think will be really hard about polling this year is that the House battleground is huge. You know, there are maybe 60 districts that we really care about right now that are worth polling. Historically, there are not very many polls that we even get at all in individual House races. The average House poll is pretty inaccurate. There are a lot of undecided voters because people haven't heard of the candidates and they don't make up their mind until the end. The sample size on House polls is smaller. You get 500 people usually in a House poll, not 1,000. So, you know, at the end of the race, we could be looking at these 60 districts. We might have one poll in each of them with a margin of error of 8. And, you know, we're going to say, okay, you know, it looks like maybe there are more toss-ups that the Democrats will need to win than the Republicans or vice versa, which would give us an indication of who's favored. But it's not going to be like a Senate race or a Senate year or a presidential year where it's like, we have 15 polls of Missouri and Claire McCaskill's up 1.5. And, you know, obviously that 1.5 could be wrong, but like you at least think you know what the polls say. This year, we're not even going to really know what we think the polls say. And the polls could still be wrong even if we know what they said. And the generic ballot has similar problems in that it's a rough national measure, and you know you can go on the internet and see all sorts of people trying to figure out whether the Democrats will win the House popular vote, whether if the Democrats won the House popular vote by 7, whether that means they take the House or not. And that's just you know those are fun games to play a year before the election with your statistical toys on your computer. But like in the end, like it comes down to individual districts, and we're just not going to have the information necessary to make a clean call on that.
So do we just live in uncertainty?
Well, I mean, that's usually my take on things, but like, I hope it's like particularly easy to do that this year, you know.
So we're going to get to questions in just a minute, and I want to encourage folks to look for the microphones around the room, and if you're following this on Facebook, to submit questions via that platform, because we'll be taking some of those as well. In all seriousness about the media and Trump, the dean had a little fun with us, and we've sort of returned the favor a little bit. But I do want to sort of, in the spirit of those sort of issues that were raised, New York Times is a powerful institution. The media is enormously influential in national politics, and so I'd like to sort of pause for a moment of introspection and just ask people, and if I'm ambushing you a little bit here, so if you want me to start, that's okay. To sort of talk about how you're approaching this election differently, if at all, than you did 2016. Was there a takeaway from that experience that has sort of shaped or adjusted the way you're processing this campaign?
I mean, I'm happy to start. I mean, and to be clear, and it's a good question, and there's no there is no doubt about the Times' influence. The Times is not omnipotent, and it's not able to influence things quite the way I think people think it is. But we are obviously an enormously powerful institution, and we need to be constantly looking at what we have done. I know that people don't think we have done enough of that, and I think that people are understandably very concerned and angry about the times we are living in, and some of that anger goes toward us. I think that my biggest takeaway on what I would like to have be different for this year, and I candidly have not quite figured out how to do that from what we did in 2016, is that in 2016, as you remember very well, it was like we were constantly in one of those cartoons where the snowball starts rolling down the hill. But the hill is Trump, and like we're the snowball, right? And it's like, and he threw out so many different things. And I mean, I think that there are legitimate criticisms about our coverage of Hillary Clinton, about our coverage of emails. I think that the biggest issue, frankly, in terms of the media and Trump in 2016 was TV, going live with his rallies all the time. You see a lot less of that now. I think you basically only see Fox News do that. And then they have chyrons saying other networks won't show you this, which they did the other night, which was quite something. But what I would like to find a way to do, at least for myself, and I'm attempting to, is slow everything down. I mean, my fear is that everything is moving so incredibly fast that A, that's how we make mistakes, and B, that's how we don't see the bigger picture and how Trump just kind of then moves on to something else. It's not a huge takeaway, but it is the one that I think is the most immediate.
It's like, remember Korea, right? It's like, that really just happened 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the biggest challenges that we have is that things are moving so quickly. I think it's a little hard. That's a really good question. I think it's easier to answer in a presidential race than in a congressional race, because congressional races are so kind of like out there. And the one thing I'm a little concerned of is that there was so much criticism that papers, the Times, didn't really get at the Trump voter, that sometimes I wonder, people were caught by surprise by what happened, that sometimes I wonder whether we might go a little bit too far in the opposite direction. I get the spirit, but I always remind people that, and everyone here knows this, like this race was basically decided in 4 states by 80,000 votes. So I never thought, I think journalism clearly, didn't have its finest hour. We didn't have our finest hour in 2016, but I never thought that the race was that much of a comment on where the American electorate is. There's a lot of people took away from. It certainly was a comment on what was going to happen, right? It had a profound impact. We were reminded again today by the Supreme Court decisions. But I was always a little bit reluctant to sort of look at that and say, this country is moving in this direction and we missed it. I for one don't quite buy that, frankly.
We had, I guess, a somewhat different set of journalistic concerns to think about in the political data and forecasting and polling and modeling world. I think that we haven't made any 100% decisions about how we're going to approach the fall, but I think that there are 2 things that I think the principles are pretty set. One is that, we have pretty big reservations about how the probabilistic forecasting thing played out. That's saying that Clinton had an 85% chance of victory. I think that, I'm not going to go into the details on whether we like that number or not, but from a mathematical perspective, I think we're still pretty comfortable with the model itself. But I don't think that people got the impression that we wanted them to get out of it. And this is something we knew before the election, including from really smart people that rose flags for us, to take someone who I went around with a few times and hopefully won't mind, Mattapuzzo, who's a investigative journalist who was in the Washington Bureau. We'd talk about the race and he'd listen to me talk about Trump winning white working class voters big, and then he'd be like, but I don't get how it's 80. We'd try and explain, 80% is like having a 7-point lead at the beginning of the 4th quarter in a football game, or it's like a 45-yard field goal attempt, or any number of things. But I don't think it gave the impression that we wanted it to give.
Because voters don't get that. The problem is that voters don't get, I get that. You were talking to you. Voters don't get that. And I think the 2 other problems with that, because I realized, this is really complicated stuff, is that one, it made a lot of voters think that Democrats think that Clinton was going to win. A lot of people didn't like her, so they just didn't bother to vote or threw their vote away. And I also think it influenced the way the race was covered. I think that to some extent, everyone was coming in, I'm not just talking about the Times, I'm talking about every newspaper thinking, Clinton is going to win. So you saw a whole lot of stories that were just if you go back and look, how Trump is losing and how Clinton is winning. And I don't blame any journalist for that at all, but they're coming in, they're seeing the same polling data that we're all seeing. And that I understand statistically what you mean when you say Clinton has an 85% probability of winning. That makes total sense to me, even though I failed statistics in college.
But one thing that I think one thing that I noticed in 2016, which I think is interesting on this point, is that when there were moments when it looked like Trump was stronger, when the probabilities narrowed, or if you went out and sort of talked about Trump's strength, there was a lot of pushback against that. I think there were a lot of people that believed in a visceral and deep way that Clinton couldn't really lose this way because Trump was like a facially unqualified and cartoonish candidate who couldn't be taken seriously.
No, that's right.
And look, that's how I felt at the beginning of the Republican primary. So I understand that. But I think that this was the reluctance to believe that Trump could lose, or rather that Trump could win, was really deep and went beyond the polling data itself. And the second thing, though, to that point, and I think it was a problem in weird as it is to say this, I think that there weren't enough good polls in 2016. And I'm not saying that good polls would have shown Trump winning, but there's a lot of junk out there. And, a lot of
state polls, nationals,
good national polls. There's a lot of terrible state polls out there. There will be a lot of terrible district polls this year. And look, it's a problem because, whether, you want to play a forecasting game or not, people are going to look at those numbers and they will, make a judgment about the outcome of the race. And so I think we are really seriously looking at trying to do more high quality polling at the state level.
But we gotta go to questions now. So you two can continue this at recess. I guess just to not let myself off the hook, I guess I would say, I think that we need to figure out a way to talk about the sort of intangible qualities of campaigns and the movements around them that are harder to measure in polling and that are harder to convey with like really total authority. Anybody who went to a Clinton rally and a Trump rally in 2016 would have told you that all the energy was on one side of that race, or overwhelmingly the energy was on one side of that race. And we had sort of conditioned ourselves from 2012 to trust the data, right? And I don't think we should discard the data. There's been this backlash against polling that I think is hugely counterproductive. But, you know, when you see events happening like Joe Crowley losing in New York, that tells you something about political energy that it isn't necessarily something that you can explain just by citing the latest Gallup poll, and I think we got to get better
Well, no,
at
because what we've always been taught, and then I'm
articulating
sorry, I will let us go to questions, but what we've always been taught in journalism is actually don't judge based on those
Right.
intangibles that you're seeing. To your point about data, like those intangibles do matter.
Right. Okay, so put up your hands. I will call on you, and a microphone will come to you. Let's start in the very back on the aisle there. And I would just ask that everybody remember that the best questions are brief and end in a question mark.
Hi, thank you. Try to make it short. You brought up top two and about how the Democrats might have shot themselves in the foot by having too many candidates for the primary. And the New York Times last week the editorial board did a thing on the top ranked choice voting, which actually has some significant flaws with it. And I'm a fan. I used to be a fan of ranked voting, but now I'm a fan of star voting, which is first you score them, like with Amazon, from 0 to 5, and then you do an instant runoff. So I guess most of my question is this, I guess, is to Nate, since you're kind of the math person there, is I'm thinking that if star voting had been the method, that Trump would not have won.
I have no idea.
You have no idea. Thank you.
It's a good question.
That's good. I think it's a good question.
I'm sorry, I wish we could do more for you there.
Can't answer that one.
Yes, on the aisle there. You look familiar.
Is the Republican Party becoming a cult?
Can we direct that question to a former CNN commentator named Bill Schneider? What do you think?
I'm asking you.
How would you define a cult? I'm not.
Trump, when he met the leader of North Korea, he made remarks like, "I'd like to be treated the way he's treated." And when he saw a TV broadcast by a newscaster in North Korea, which was very worshipful of the leader of North Korea, he said, "Let's see if we can get a TV station to hire that woman." Is the Republican Party becoming a cult?
I'm going to avoid the word cult just because I don't want to get beaten up. But I don't think that's a bad word. But I think it is becoming a party of one person. That it's becoming the party of Trump. And that we're seeing, you know, what I might suggest is blind loyalty to Trump, no matter what he does or what he says. So if that's your, I mean, when I hear the word cult, I think of Rosemary's Baby and the people down in the basement, you know, guys all know that, right? So that's why I'm a little bit reluctant to say that. But I guess that what I would say is sort of redefining what you just said in the same way. Is that a good dodge?
Yes, the young woman in the back.
Could you comment a little bit more on the D-on-D races, and especially what is the DCCC up to? In addition to the New York 14 race tonight that you mentioned, we had a race here, the California 48th district. 2 Democrats ran. They, tied basically. One was endorsed by the DCCC. One was endorsed by the California Democratic Party. I mean, I don't see those actions as productive from the DCCC to go against what the local party's doing, whoever the candidate is. But what is your thought? Because what we're seeing here in the States is not the right kind of support from the DCCC.
I'm going to start and then I'm going to defer to Alex because he wrote a really good story on this. I think sorry, I sound like a DC nerd. The DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, is just trying to pick the candidate that it thinks has the best chance of winning. And in that case, there was a difference of opinion between the DTRIP and the state Democratic Party. What can I tell you? I think at the end of the day, and I'm sure you agree with this, the Democrats avoided catastrophe. I mean, they were really, really thinking that there were going to be 3 races where they're going to be shut out. And I think DTRIP played their cards pretty well. I mean, can you imagine the kind of backlash there would have been if that had happened? So.
No, and one of the few districts in California where they didn't get involved was that Jeff Denham seat, the 10th. And they very nearly got locked out just because there was nobody telling Democrats, you got to vote and you got to vote for this guy. So I think California, by any objective measure, it was disruptive and made a lot of people angry for them to get involved. As a purely tactical decision, I think they were hugely vindicated by the results. There have been other primaries where they've been less successful at picking a winner. This primary in central Kentucky, the DCCC, Democrats had a candidate running, Amy McGrath. You've probably all seen her campaign launch video, which raised her like an unbelievable amount of money because it was so compelling and vivid. After she was already running for several months, national Democrats went and recruited the popular mayor of Lexington, Kentucky, thinking that he would be a stronger general election candidate. And McGrath just smoked him, right? That's putting it a little strongly, but like she won pretty convincingly over a guy who was like a titan of local Democratic politics. So I do think the evidence is there that when the local support is simply not there for someone who the nationals get behind, the DCCC can't sort of anoint somebody. The top two system made California pretty weird. But thank you for that question. I'm going to go to Facebook from Adrian L. And I wish that I had a location for this person so that I could go like full NPR/Rush Limbaugh. But Adrian L. asked that Cortez, this is the candidate who, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who defeated Joe Crowley, was seen as such a long shot that our paper essentially did not cover that campaign.
Right.
So what lesson do we draw from that? What does it say about media and politics in this moment that such a thing could occur?
I mean, it's an excellent question, and what was your phrase earlier? Not our finest hour. Not our finest hour that we did not cover that race. In all seriousness,
I mean, it happens, but it's like the ultimate nightmare.
It's not just that. Yeah,
right?
it happens. It happens, and we also invested a ton of energy in this Staten Island race,
right,
where the person who was believed to be, the convicted felon who seemed like he had a real shot, was completely trounced by the Trump-backed candidate. And so all of this energy went into this race that ended up not being particularly interesting or telling and didn't reverse a trend.
But it did have interesting characters.
It had colorful, interesting characters.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not saying it was bad to cover, but I think there is a legitimate and serious concern about how all papers, not just us, but certainly us, allocate resources. I don't know how many times we're going to see something like this play out. Apparently a lot, but I mean...
Sometimes you just don't see it coming, especially in the congressional race for the reason you said, right? Unless...
Right.
There were no polls there for what it's worth.
I think there's no polls there.
There weren't any polls in
right.
I
think the reason to cover it, the argument I would have made for covering this more for everybody, not just the Times, is that Joe Crowley was a potential next Speaker of the House. And I just don't know how you don't, the assumption should not be, and therefore he's going to be fine. And so I think that is something that we need to take a look at.
I guess to me, the thing that I'm a little ambivalent about, and I'll be fast, a little bit ambivalent about is there are so many primaries, right?
Well,
I do think that Crowley as a character sort of deserved attention because especially the Eric Cantor precedent and the very real shot as of a couple hours ago that he could be the next Speaker of the House. But how many resources would you have wanted the media to put into covering like a Senate race in Alabama?
No, I think that's right.
Prior to finding out that Roy Moore was a convincingly alleged pedophile, right? We benefited from the fact that that was the only thing going on at the moment.
Right.
The next question, you, sir. Yes.
So the most surprising thing to me tonight, besides the Joe Crowley of it all, was that Oklahoma in the governor's race, the Democrats almost got as many votes as the Republicans did.
Not a surprise.
I know it's not. I know it's not like a huge surprise. I guess.
No, it's a closed primary, and the Democrats still have a huge registration advantage there. So they always have nearly as many votes as the Republicans, even in 2016.
Cool. I guess my question there is, okay. Well, let me counter that a little bit. When I look at Richard Ojada's poll number, when I look at the teacher walkouts in West Virginia, and when I look at what's happening in Oklahoma, and when I look at Kirsten Sinema's poll number today in Arizona, from legitimate good pollsters, I wonder, is there something happening with these teacher walkouts that are affecting how politics are going to play out in November?
Nate, are these good polls?
I think they are good polls. And one thing that both West Virginia and Oklahoma have in common is that they have a very large number of people who remain registered as Democrats, who still often vote for Democrats for state and local office, and who won't even consider voting for a national liberal Democratic presidential candidate. But if you have the right candidate who is a military veteran and says that he opposes gun control and maybe shoots something in an ad, then now you're back in the game. And I think that it's interesting to me that despite just how well Trump did in those areas, that Democrats still appear to be, at least for now, before the campaign begins in earnest, appear to be viable. And on the education question more specifically, I don't have a good sense of how that's played out at the individual state or district level. I think it's certainly true that all three of those states have seen a lot of activism on the issue, so I'm open to the idea that that's a factor, but I don't have any meaty evidence to bring to bear to prove that you're right or wrong.
Yes. Yes, you. Just wait for the mic just 1 second.
So for all the ways in which we've been jolted in our sort of traditional ways of conceptualizing elections, I haven't yet heard you address the role of Russian interference in elections. And I'd like to know how you think we can reckon with that in the future and remain meaningful participants in the election process with this wild card that is so massive and unpredictable.
Look, it's a good question.
It's a big one.
Yeah.
I don't want to be boring like I was in the last question, but I just don't, I have not been persuaded that Russia was decisive in the last election. I mean, it could have been, but it's in an election that was decided by 7/10 of a vote, 7/10 of a point. I can list 100 things that could have been decisive, including the former FBI director. So, I don't know that I believe that American politics needs to be thought of radically different because, an outside actor might be the equivalent of a big new super PAC. Is that what Russia basically was in the last election? I don't know.
I would counter that.
You think it's less than that or more than that?
More. I agree with you in terms of the statistical analysis of factors in 2016, and it was a bit of a perfect storm of events. Including a Democratic candidate who had been on the political scene, which we have not mentioned yet tonight, for 30 years and was a pretty known quantity in her own right, and who people felt very passionately in one direction or the other about. I do think that Russian interference is a big deal, and I do think, going forward, I think that it's very hard to analyze, to Nate's point, what role it played. But I think that if you accept that Vladimir Putin's goal is to disrupt the system here and to sow dissent, I think that seems to have been pretty effective, right, in a variety of ways. And I think that there was a couple of stories this week. I think we had one, and the Washington Post had one, about how tech leaders here in California met with intelligence community officials, and they're about what to do for 2018 and to get prepared, which there's been extremely little talk about. And according to our paper, the takeaway for people in the room on the tech side was you're sort of on your own dealing with this for 2018. I think that if you accept the premise that Russia interfered in an election, and if you accept the premise that Russia found success doing that, then you would have to assume that Russia is going to keep trying to find success, and you would have to assume the other tactic, the tactic they used already, is not going to work forever, so there could be a new tactic. Which is not a great answer to your question if it was looking for an absolute response, because I don't have one. I don't have a great answer, but I think it's a really important question and one that does not get talked about enough for 2018.
So we're unfortunately out of time. I would just try to add on a maybe somewhat slightly upbeat note. When you look at the things that Russia did in our elections, or is alleged to have done in our elections last time, almost all of them involved playing upon sort of existing cultural and social weaknesses in the United States.
Absolutely.
Exploiting racial divisions, taking advantage of people who aren't literate about internet information, can't sort of distinguish real news from fake news.
Right.
When you look at some of the Facebook ads that they apparently ran, they were sort of cartoonishly rudimentary, right? And the kind of thing that it's hard to imagine people seeing as legitimate, some of these sort of Hillary Clinton as the devil with horns and all of that. So I do think there's a great deal that the United States can do and that Americans can do to sort of strengthen their own participation in democracy, where it might get to a point where those kind of tactics would just matter less, that would be less effective because people would be able to distinguish, no, this is obviously not the case that John Podesta is involved in a child sex ring, right? That was not just Russia. But in any event, I want to thank everybody again for coming. Thank UCLA.
Thank you.
You're all going to get an email tomorrow inviting you to subscribe to our daily newsletter, California Today, and I would strongly encourage you to do that. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent job.
You were
great.
You were
Shut this down.
Shut it down now. You were phenomenal. I could not have done what you just did.
I agree.